Happy Frazetta Friday, Frazetta fans. I'm Sara, and tonight I'm going to talk a bit about some of the earliest inspirations and influences that helped my grandfather to pursue art as a career. There's the old question, are artists born with a God-given talent, or do they become artists through teaching, hard work, and encouragement? The nature versus nurture argument is as old as the hills, and many books supporting both sides have been and continue to be published with no end and no real conclusions in sight. As science continues mapping the brain and psychologists advance techniques for deciphering the quirks of human behavior, other questions pop up as a result. Regardless of progress, we're still a long way from having concrete explanations as to how and why artists become artists of any sort, much less great ones. For my part, when it comes to Frank Frazetta, my grandfather, I think it's safe to say that it was a combination of nature and nurture that made him who he was. He said that he started drawing almost as soon as he could pick up a pencil, and his earliest encouragement came from his maternal grandmother. Whether he was a prodigy or not is open to debate, but he always said that art came very easily to him without study or much thought. But it's also obvious from the piles of childhood drawings and early sketchbooks that he was always practicing, learning, and trying to improve. Frazetta's grade school teachers were also impressed with his abilities and suggested that his parents enroll him in Michele Falanga's Brooklyn Academy of Fine Art, which they did when he was 8 years old. Professor Falanga was highly regarded both as an artist and as a teacher, and he was happy to act as a tutor to young Frank. The school was nearly 9 miles away from the Frazetta's home in Sheepshead Bay, and he was only able to attend on Saturdays. So Falanga gave the Frazetta family a deep discount on the $8 monthly tuition. Classes at the academy were from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., and under Falanga's guidance, Frazetta learned some of the basics of painting, drawing, and design and composition. He once said, "We used to sit around and draw anything we wanted to as students. It was very informal. In the summer, we would go out in the field and paint some old church or whatever. There's where my style developed. And by that, I mean brush technique. Not that I was trying to look like Falanga. He wasn't an influence on my style at all, but he gave me plenty to think about." Frazetta took classes from 1936 until Michele Falanga's death on February 1st, 1942, a little over a week before Frazetta's 14th birthday. Falanga's mentorship and his being around other artists of all ages and skill levels deeply affected him, but at the same time, he was also being inspired by virtually everything that he saw. Frazetta was excited by the cover paintings by J. Allen St. John for pulps and Edgar Rice Burroughs novels that his uncle would bring home and share with him, by the Captain America comic books drawn by Jack Kirby, and by the Western swashbucklers, Buck Rogers serials, monster movies, and cartoons he watched at the local theater. Frazetta often cited Fantasia, particularly the Night on Bald Mountain sequence, Frankenstein, Pinocchio, and especially King Kong as major influences on his visual and dramatic senses. Before television and the internet, virtually everyone read newspapers every day, and polls showed that the comic section was considered the most important part of them. They were so popular that during the 1930s, papers featured between 12 and 24 pages of comics, and many artists became not only famous, but extremely wealthy. Frazetta's favorites included E.C. Sager's Timbal Theater. He claimed he drew Popeye so many times in his youth that he almost was as good as Sager, Milton Caniff's Terry and the Pirates, Al Capp's Little Abner, and perhaps most significantly, Hal Foster's Tarzan and later Prince Valiant. My grandpa once said Caniff was a god to me in those days. I loved Terry and the Pirates, and I copied him for quite a while when I was a kid. But I eventually realized it just wasn't me. It wasn't what I wanted to do. So I started looking more closely at Foster's Tarzan and knew it was more like the way I wanted to draw. Prince Valiant was great too, maybe even better drawn, but it was Foster's Tarzan that really got me going. Foster's art turned out to be a major artistic influence on Frazetta, one that was reflected in his work to one degree or another for the rest of his life. As he did with Caniff, he initially imitated Foster, occasionally even swiping him. But my grandpa soon used that influence combined with many others as a springboard to create a style that was uniquely, identifiably Frazetta. He said, "The older I got, the more I realized I didn't want to be Caniff, and I didn't want to be Foster. I wanted to be me." When he was 16, Frazetta was introduced to pulp and comics artist Giunta and became his apprentice. Though he admitted that he couldn't relate to Giunta personally, he did learn quite a bit about effective storytelling and drawing for reproduction during their time together. Frazetta said, "Giunta had an interesting way of spotting blacks, and I picked that up right away. You can see some of his influence in my art if you know what to look for." For those unfamiliar with the term spotting blacks, in comics means strategically placing areas of black within a drawing to give it weight and contrast. It helps to set the mood and establish lighting, and when done right, the black areas can help with the storytelling by focusing the reader's eyes just where the artist wants them to be. After a short while with Giunta, Frazetta began assisting other artists with their comics as a part of the Bernard Bailey studio, and eventually started drawing his own stories for Standard Comics. He was mentored by art directors Graham Ingalls, who would go on to become famous for his EC horror stories and whom Frazetta credited as the first person that really believed in him, and Ralph Mayo. Frazetta really looked up to Mayo, who encouraged him to study anatomy and lent him one of his George Bridgman's anatomy books, which Frazetta enthusiastically sat down and copied in one night. The light bulb suddenly clicked in his head and he said, "My drawings immediately got better after that. My figures suddenly started to make sense to me." The more he drew, the better he got, so that by the age of 19, he was making his living working for various comic companies like Avon, Toby, A1, and Fawcett. Around 1948, Frazetta met and became friends with Al Williamson, who was 3 years younger, and the two began collaborating on a variety of Western and science fiction stories. Al was taking classes at Bern Hogarth's Cartoonist and Illustrator School, which eventually became the School of Visual Arts. And in 1949, he introduced him to a fellow student, Roy Krenkel, who would become one of the most important influences in my grandfather's life. A World War II vet who studied the George Bridgman, remember the anatomy book, before being drafted, Roy was 10 years older than Frazetta and was attending Hogarth School on the GI Bill. A voracious reader and an avid collector of illustrated books, pulps, comics, and magazines, Roy was sometimes affectionately called the Professor because of his encyclopedic knowledge. He happily introduced Frazetta and Al to an entire host of artists from around the world, including Norman Lindsay, Franklin Booth, Jean-Léon Jerome, the Pre-Raphaelites, Jose Sagreus, Charles R. Knight, and Zdenek Burian, among many others. It shouldn't surprise anyone that Frazetta appreciated the unashamed sexuality in Lindsay's art, but it should be noted that Burian's paintings of dinosaurs and caveman also had a lasting influence on both Frazetta and Williamson. Thanks to Al and Roy, Frazetta's circle of artist friends quickly grew to include Nick Meglin, Joe Orlando, Angelo Torres, George Woodbridge, George Evans, Harvey Kurtzman, and Wally Wood. Through the early 1950s, they would invade the EC Comics offices, go to the movies, chase girls, play baseball, talk about their art ambitions, take part in early life drawing classes, and often collaborate on each other's jobs. And whenever anyone needed an idea or reference material or had a technical questions, Professor Krenkel was there to help and encourage. Roy was always lifting everyone else up, and I'll return to his significance in a bit after I talk a little bit about someone else that was another major influence in more ways than one. From 1952 to 1953, Frazetta was the artist for a race car comic strip, Johnny Comet. Despite a name change to Ace McCoy, it never found an audience and was canceled exactly 1 year after it began. Though he didn't get rich like he had hoped, he did get experience working for a newspaper syndicate, and in the process impressed Al Capp, the creator of Little Abner. Following an offer over lunch at the Waldorf Astoria, Frazetta joined Capp's studio in 1954, and let me just say, that was a big deal. Without the slightest bit of exaggeration, Little Abner was the most popular newspaper comics in the 1950s, a true pop culture phenomenon of that day, and Capp was internationally famous. The residents of Dogpatch were licensed to advertise all manner of products, and Capp employed a staff of artists to help him meet deadlines and obligations. Though he was drawing the Sunday page, it was really a collaborative job. Other studio assistants would ink the backgrounds, create color guides for the engravers, and do the lettering. But no matter how much help he had, Capp insisted on his drawing and inking the characters' faces and hands, especially of Abner and Daisy May, and his finishes were discernible. My grandfather said Al had the touch. He knew how to take an otherwise ordinary drawing and really make it pop. I'll never knock his talent. Renowned for its political humor and social satire, Little Abner was also extremely popular for the beautiful, voluptuous women filling the strip. My grandpa would probably disagree, but arguably you can see a glimmer of what would later become the Frazetta Girl in Grandpa's numerous drawings of Daisy May, the Wolf Gal, and Moonbeam McSwine. Initially, Frazetta would stay in Boston during the week, sleeping either on a cot or in the studio or at a cheap nearby hotel, and would go back to Brooklyn on the weekends. After he proved that he could do the job and had earned Capp's trust that he would deliver on time, Frazetta began working from home. He would say that it only took him a day to pencil the Little Abner Sunday page, and then he'd spend the rest of the week doing whatever he wanted. He would then mail the page to the studio via special delivery or hand it to Capp whenever he was in New York, which was often. On the occasion Al needed him for a hot advertising or editorial job, Frazetta would take the train to Boston and be paid an additional $100 a day on top of his salary, which he thought was absolutely great. In the meantime, Frazetta also continued to draw comics and covers for other publishers as a freelancer to supplement his income. It was while staying in Boston that he drew the rejected cover for Famous Funnies that he subsequently sold to Bill Gaines to use on Weird Science Fantasy number 29. Unfortunately, the extra money dried up when the industry collapsed under widespread pressure from civic groups and politicians who had become convinced that comic books were contributing to juvenile delinquency. Not newspaper comics, though. They were too popular and were safe from the critics. By 1955, most of his clients had either cut their lines or gone out of business entirely, and many of his friends were pounding the pavement looking for work. So Frazetta gratefully settled in as an anonymous ghost in Capp's studio. With only a few exceptions, virtually everything he drew for 7 years was for Little Abner, that is, until 1961. My grandparents were in the middle of moving into a new house when Al Capp called and asked Grandpa to come to Boston to work for a few days on a short deadline advertising job. After Grandma said that they could use the extra money and that she would handle unpacking the boxes, he agreed to come up, but first wanted to make sure it was the same deal, $100 a day on top of his salary. Capp quickly responded that things had been tight for him lately and instead offered my grandpa $50 a day to come to the studio. He was furious and remembered, "I never asked for a pay raise, not one thin dime, in all the years I worked for him, and now he wanted me to go to Boston and work like a dog for half the pay. So I told him, it's $100 a day, pal, or you can find yourself another boy." As you might have guessed, he did not get the $100 a day, or even $50, and that was the end of his job with Al Capp's studio. Frazetta knew how good he was and didn't think he'd have any trouble getting a job with someone else, but he didn't realize how much power Capp actually had and quickly discovered that none of the other cartoonists would hire him for their studios. Still, by 1961, the comic book industry had rebounded from its darkest days of the mid-1950s, and Frazetta thought that he could pick up where he'd left off. But he was in for a rude awakening. He hadn't updated his portfolio since the 1950s and styles had changed. Though he was willing to do whatever they asked for whatever they'd pay, none of the comic publishers would give him work. Things were pretty tough financially for a while. His friend George Evans hired him to ink some of his comic stories to, as my grandfather said, keep the wolf from the door. But he quickly began looking elsewhere for jobs. He illustrated several erotic novels for Midwood. My grandmother would demurely refer to them as gentlemen's books, and accepted commissions from several of the cheaper imitations of Playboy like Gent. But remember Roy Krenkel? Roy, despite having a lot of self-doubt about his own art, truly was something of a mover and a shaker. He knew people, and more importantly, people knew him and respected his opinion. And his opinion was that Frank Frazetta was the best artist he knew, period. When the Canaveral Press hired him to illustrate an edition of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs, he immediately started badgering the publisher to get this guy Frazetta. They listened and hired my grandfather to illustrate Tarzan at the Earth's Core in 1962. When rumors of a new comics magazine called Creepy started circulating, he insisted that Frazetta get involved. When Roy heard that Lancer Books was going to start publishing the Conan stories, he told editor Larry Shaw, Frazetta is the only man for the job. Whenever Frazetta had technical questions about painting and oils, Roy was there. Whenever he wanted to bounce ideas off someone, Roy was there. Whenever he needed encouragement, a shoulder to cry on, reference material, or someone just to make him laugh, he could count on Professor Krenkel. In many ways, he was a father figure, and my grandpa would say, Roy could always make me go. He pushed me when I needed pushing the most, and a lot of my paintings were done with him in mind, not the publishers. His approval meant a lot to me. Every artist has a number of inspirations and influences and people who help them in their lives, but it's what they ultimately do with that that determines whether they're going to be successful and popular or not. Falanga, Krenkel, Capp, and everyone else that I've mentioned and others that I haven't were all part of my grandfather's wonderful journey as an artist. He was able to learn from each of them and improve and grow and become the Frank Frazetta that the world loves today. Naturally, there are other people who are equally important in my grandfather's career, but I've reached my time limit and we'll have to talk about them perhaps sometime in the future. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you all again on the next Frazetta Friday.